When veteran television host Margaret Stevens thought she could ambush political strategist Linda Morrison on national morning television, she believed her decades of experience would guarantee another viral takedown moment. What she didn't anticipate was that Morrison had spent months preparing for this exact confrontation, armed with evidence that would not only destroy Stevens' credibility, but send shockwaves through the entire Sunrise broadcasting network. The cameras were rolling. 40 million viewers were watching, and what happened in the next 12 minutes would forever change how America views media integrity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of October 15th started like any other at Sunrise Broadcasting Network's Manhattan headquarters. The glass towers gleamed in the early sunlight, reflecting the bustling energy of a city that never sleeps. Inside Studio 7A, the flagship, morning show Wake Up America was preparing for what producers had billed as a routine political discussion segment. Coffee cups steamed on production desks, makeup artists applied final touches under bright studio lights, and camera operators adjusted their angles with practiced precision. Margaret Stevens, the show's lead anchor for the past 18 years, sat in her familiar chair, reviewing her notes one final time. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her navy blazer pressed to perfection, and her expression carried the confident authority of someone who had interviewed presidents, celebrities, and world leaders. At 56, Stevens had built her reputation on being uncompromising, direct, and utterly fearless when confronting guests who dared to challenge the network's editorial stance. Her producer had briefed her thoroughly on today's guest, political strategist Linda Morrison, and Stevens was ready for what she assumed would be another straightforward political sparring match. Linda Morrison sat across from her in the guest chair, appearing remarkably calm for someone about to face one of television's most notorious interviewers. At 42, Morrison was known in political circles for her analytical mind and her ability to remain composed under pressure. She wore a simple charcoal suit, minimal jewelry, and carried herself with quiet confidence. What viewers couldn't see was the leather portfolio resting beside her chair, filled with documents that she had spent the better part of 6 months compiling and verifying through multiple independent sources. The studio buzzed with the familiar pre-show energy. Lighting technicians made final adjustments, the makeup team touched up both women's appearances, and the floor manager began the countdown sequence that every live television professional knows by heart. In the control room, executive producer David Walsh watched the monitors with satisfaction. He had personally orchestrated this segment, viewing it as an opportunity to showcase Stevens' interviewing prowess while addressing what he called the network's responsibility to challenge certain political narratives. What Walsh didn't know was that Morrison had been expecting this invitation for months. She had refused previous appearances on other networks, waiting specifically for this moment, for this show, for this host. Her research team had uncovered a pattern of behavior that went far beyond editorial bias, diving deep into financial relationships, undisclosed conflicts of interest, and coordinated messaging campaigns that violated both journalistic ethics and federal broadcasting regulations. The red recording light illuminated, and Stevens launched into her introduction with the polished delivery that had made her a household name. Her voice carried across living rooms throughout America as she welcomed viewers to what she promised would be an enlightening discussion about the current political landscape. She introduced Morrison with professional courtesy, but those familiar with Stevens' style could detect the subtle edge in her tone, the slight narrowing of her eyes that suggested this would be anything but a friendly conversation. Morrison responded to the introduction with a gracious nod and a genuine smile, her hands folded comfortably in her lap. She had spent years studying Stevens' interview techniques, watching countless segments, analyzing the patterns of interruption, the strategic timing of commercial breaks, and the way certain guests were systematically undermined through carefully crafted questions designed more to embarrass than to inform. The first few minutes proceeded according to script. Stevens asked standard questions about recent political developments. Morrison provided thoughtful responses backed by data and historical context, and the audience at home might have assumed they were witnessing a typical morning news segment. But seasoned political observers would have noticed something unusual in Morrison's demeanor. She wasn't simply answering questions, she was steering the conversation, methodically establishing credibility and setting the foundation for what was to come. Stevens, growing impatient with Morrison's composed responses, began to show the aggressive side that had made her both famous and controversial. Her questions became more pointed, her interruptions more frequent, and her facial expressions increasingly dismissive. She leaned forward in her chair, employing body language designed to intimidate and demonstrate dominance over her guest. The studio audience, a carefully selected group of network supporters, began to shift uncomfortably as the tension escalated. Morrison continued to respond with measured calm, never raising her voice, never allowing emotion to crack her professional facade. But viewers paying close attention might have noticed her right hand moving almost imperceptibly toward the portfolio beside her chair. She was waiting for the right moment, the precise opening that would allow her to shift from defense to offense in a way that would be impossible to dismiss or deflect. The conversation took its first sharp turn when Stevens accused Morrison of spreading misinformation about the network's reporting practices. Her voice carried the righteous indignation of someone defending not just her own reputation, but the integrity of journalism itself. She cited specific examples of what she claimed were Morrison's false statements, her tone growing more heated with each accusation. The camera captured every micro-expression, every gesture, as Stevens built her case for why Morrison couldn't be trusted as a credible source. Morrison listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding as if acknowledging points she found particularly interesting. When Stevens finally paused, expecting either a defensive response or an admission of wrongdoing, Morrison smiled slightly and asked a simple question that would later be analyzed by media scholars as a masterclass in strategic communication. She asked Stevens whether she believed transparency was important in journalism, whether viewers had a right to know about potential conflicts of interest that might influence coverage. The question seemed innocuous enough, and Stevens answered with the standard response about the network's commitment to ethical journalism and full disclosure. She spoke passionately about the sacred trust between news organizations and their audiences, about the responsibility to report truth, regardless of political pressure or financial considerations. Her words were eloquent, her delivery convincing, and she appeared to be regaining control of the narrative. That was when Morrison reached for her portfolio. The movement was subtle, professional, almost casual. She removed a single document, placed it on the table between them, and asked Stevens if she was familiar with Meridian Communications Group. The question was delivered with the same calm tone Morrison had maintained throughout the interview, but something in the studio atmosphere changed immediately. Stevens' confident expression flickered for just a moment, a micro-expression that trained observers would later dissect frame by frame. Meridian Communications Group, Morrison explained to the audience, was a consulting firm that had received significant payments from the network over the past 3 years. The firm specialized in what they called strategic messaging coordination, working with multiple media outlets to ensure consistent coverage of certain political topics. Morrison's voice remained steady as she detailed how this arrangement worked, how talking points were distributed, how coverage was synchronized across different platforms to create the appearance of independent consensus. Stevens attempted to interrupt, to redirect the conversation back to the original topic, but Morrison continued speaking with quiet authority. She explained how she had obtained these documents through Freedom of Information Act requests, how she had verified the financial relationships through public records, and how she had cross-referenced the timing of payments with specific coverage. Decisions. Every statement was backed by documentation, every claim supported by evidence that could be independently verified. The studio fell into an unusual silence. Even the background noise of cameras and equipment seemed muted as Morrison methodically laid out her case. She wasn't making accusations. She was presenting facts. She wasn't attacking Stevens personally. She was exposing a system of coordinated manipulation that went far beyond any individual journalist or anchor. Stevens finally found her voice, attempting to dismiss Morrison's presentation as a conspiracy theory, a desperate attempt to deflect from the original topic of discussion. But her usual commanding presence had diminished noticeably. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, and her voice carried a defensive edge that regular viewers would have found uncharacteristic. Morrison reached into her portfolio again, this time removing a thick folder that she placed directly in front of Stevens. She explained that the folder contained email correspondence between network executives and Meridian Communications Group, dating back 4 years. The emails detailed specific instructions for coverage, including suggestions for which experts to interview, which questions to ask, and which perspectives to exclude from programming. The revelation hit the studio like a thunderclap. Stevens stared at the folder as if it might explode, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, anger, and something approaching panic. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the control room, producer David Walsh was frantically consulting with legal advisors, trying to determine whether the segment should be cut to commercial or allowed to continue. The decision would prove crucial, as cutting away now would only fuel speculation and give Morrison's accusations more credibility. Morrison continued her presentation with the methodical precision of a prosecutor laying out evidence before a jury. She detailed how the network had received specific instructions to frame certain political stories, how coverage had been adjusted to benefit particular candidates or policies, and how dissenting voices had been systematically excluded from programming. Each revelation was supported by documentation, each claim backed by records that Morrison had spent months verifying through multiple independent sources. Stevens made one final attempt to regain control, standing from her chair and declaring that the interview was over, that Morrison was clearly engaging in a coordinated attack designed to undermine legitimate journalism. But Morrison remained seated, calmly pointing out that they were live on national television, that 40 million viewers were watching, and that Stevens' own network had promoted this segment as an opportunity for open dialogue about political transparency. The moment of truth had arrived. Morrison opened the folder Stevens had been staring at and began reading directly from email correspondence between Stevens herself and Meridian Communications Group executives. The emails revealed that Stevens had received detailed talking points for specific interviews, that she had been coached on how to handle certain guests, and that her supposedly spontaneous questions had actually been crafted by external consultants. Working on behalf of political interests, the studio erupted into chaos. Stevens attempted to grab the documents, claiming they were fabricated, but Morrison calmly noted that all emails had been verified through digital forensics and that copies had already been provided to the Federal Communications Commission and the House Oversight Committee. Camera operators, uncertain whether to continue filming, looked to the control room for guidance, but Walsh was locked in heated conversation with network legal counsel. Morrison stood slowly, gathering her materials with the same calm efficiency she had displayed throughout the segment. She addressed the camera directly, speaking not to Stevens, but to the millions of viewers who had witnessed this unprecedented moment of media accountability. She explained that the documents she had presented represented just a fraction of the evidence she had compiled, that multiple networks were involved in similar arrangements, and that American audiences deserved to know when their news was being shaped by hidden financial relationships. Stevens, realizing that her career and reputation were collapsing in real time, made a desperate attempt to discredit Morrison personally. She raised her voice, pointing accusingly, claiming that Morrison was a political operative with her own agenda, that this entire presentation was a staged attack designed to benefit Morrison's clients. But her words lacked conviction. Her gestures appeared frantic rather than authoritative, and her credibility had been irreparably damaged by the documentary evidence Morrison had presented. The segment continued for another 6 minutes, though. It felt like hours to everyone involved. Morrison methodically answered Stevens' increasingly desperate challenges, providing additional documentation for every claim, offering specific details that could be independently verified by any journalist willing to investigate. She never raised her voice, never responded to Stevens' personal attacks, never allowed emotion to compromise her professional demeanor. When the show finally cut to commercial, the damage had been done. Social media exploded with clips from the interview. News organizations scrambled to verify Morrison's claims, and Sunrise Broadcasting Network faced the most serious credibility crisis in its corporate history. Stevens stormed off the set without speaking to anyone, while Morrison remained in the studio, calmly answering questions from production staff who were trying to understand what they had just witnessed. The aftermath would prove even more devastating than the original confrontation. Within hours, other journalists began investigating Morrison's claims, finding additional evidence of coordinated messaging campaigns and undisclosed financial relationships throughout the television news industry. Advertisers began pulling sponsorship from Sunrise Broadcasting Network programs. Shareholders demanded emergency board meetings, and federal regulators announced formal investigations into potential violations of broadcasting standards. Morrison had accomplished something unprecedented in modern media. She had used live television to expose the very mechanisms that made such manipulation possible, turning the industry's own tools against the system of corruption she had spent months documenting. Her calm, methodical presentation had been far more devastating than any emotional outburst or dramatic confrontation could have been. The story was far from over. In the days that followed, more evidence would emerge, more networks would be implicated, and the American public would begin to understand the extent to which their news had been shaped by hidden financial relationships and coordinated messaging campaigns. But it all began with one woman's decision to remain calm under pressure, to let facts speak louder than rhetoric, and to trust that truth, when properly presented, would be more powerful than any amount of money or influence. Stevens never returned. To her anchor chair, Morrison became a symbol of journalistic accountability, and 40 million Americans learned that sometimes the most important news stories are the ones that reveal how news stories are made. The commercial break lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, but for everyone inside Studio 7A, it felt like an eternity suspended in amber. Margaret Stevens stood frozen beside her anchor desk, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge so tightly that her knuckles had turned white beneath the studio lights. The confident woman who had begun the morning believing she would deliver another masterful takedown now found herself staring at documents that threatened to unravel not just her career, but the entire foundation upon which her professional identity had been built. Linda Morrison remained seated in the guest chair, her posture unchanged from when the cameras had stopped rolling. She methodically organized the remaining documents in her portfolio, each movement deliberate and unhurried. Around her, the studio buzzed with frantic activity as producers huddled in urgent conversations. Camera operators adjusted their positions, and makeup artists attempted to repair the damage that stress and studio lights had inflicted on Stevens' carefully constructed appearance. In the control room, executive producer David Walsh paced behind a bank of monitors, displaying frozen images from the explosive segment that had just concluded. His phone rang incessantly as network executives, legal advisors, and crisis management specialists all demanded immediate updates on what they were already calling the most damaging live television moment in broadcasting history. Walsh found himself in the impossible position of having to decide whether to continue the interview or cut to pre-recorded programming, knowing that either choice would carry enormous consequences for the network's future. The decision was made. For him, when Sunrise Broadcasting Network's president, Catherine Reed, arrived at the studio with a team of legal advisors and corporate communications specialists. Reed had built her reputation on crisis management, having navigated the network through several previous scandals involving ratings, manipulation, and advertiser disputes. But nothing in her 25-year career had prepared her for the systematic exposure of coordinated messaging corruption that Morrison had begun to unveil. Reed entered the studio with the commanding presence of someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure, but her usual confidence appeared strained as she surveyed the scene before her. Stevens stood isolated near her desk, having been abandoned by the usual circle of producers and assistants who typically surrounded her during commercial breaks. Morrison continued her quiet organization of documents, seemingly oblivious to the chaos swirling around her. The legal team immediately began reviewing the evidence Morrison had presented, their faces growing increasingly grave as they verified the authenticity of email headers, cross-referenced financial records, and confirmed the legitimacy of documentation that painted a devastating picture of media manipulation. Chief Legal Counsel Robert Martinez whispered urgent consultations with Reed, his expression making clear that the network faced potential regulatory violations that could result in substantial fines and possible license challenges. Stevens finally broke her silence, approaching Reed with the desperate energy of someone watching their world collapse in real time. Her voice carried none of its usual authority as she insisted that Morrison's presentation was nothing more than an elaborate setup designed to destroy legitimate journalism. She demanded that the network's security team confiscate Morrison's documents, claiming they had been obtained through illegal means and represented a coordinated attack on press freedom. Morrison looked up from her portfolio for the first time. Since the commercial break began, her calm gaze taking in the frantic activity surrounding her. She addressed Reed directly, her voice carrying the same measured tone that had characterized her entire presentation. She explained that every document in her possession had been obtained through legal channels, that copies had already been provided to federal regulators, and that additional evidence would be released regardless of how the network chose to proceed. With the remainder of the interview, the revelation that Morrison had already shared her evidence with federal authorities sent another wave of panic through the studio. Reed realized that cutting the interview short would not contain the damage, but would instead fuel speculation and give Morrison's accusations additional credibility. The network found itself trapped between allowing Morrison to continue her systematic destruction of their reputation or appearing to suppress information that was already in the hands of government investigators. Stevens made one final, desperate attempt to regain control, demanding that Morrison be removed from the studio and that the network's legal team be given time to review the documents before any additional information was broadcast. But Reed had already recognized the futility of such measures, understanding that Morrison had clearly anticipated every possible response the network might employ to limit her presentation. The floor manager began the countdown that would bring them back to live television, and Reed made the decision that would define her legacy in broadcasting. She instructed the production team to continue the interview, betting that allowing Morrison to complete her presentation would demonstrate the network's commitment to transparency and might limit the long-term damage to their credibility. Stevens returned to her anchor desk with visible reluctance, her usual pre-show preparation ritual replaced by hurried consultations with legal advisors who could offer little guidance for navigating a situation that had no precedent in television history. Morrison remained in her guest chair, her portfolio reopened and ready to continue the methodical presentation that had already sent shockwaves through the industry. The red recording light illuminated once again, and Stevens attempted to regain her professional composure as she welcomed viewers back to what she described as a continuing discussion about media accountability. But her voice lacked conviction, and experienced television viewers could detect the strain beneath her carefully modulated delivery. Morrison picked up exactly where she had left off, as if the commercial break had been nothing more than a pause in a carefully orchestrated presentation. She reached into her portfolio and withdrew a tablet device, explaining to the audience that she wanted to share audio recordings that would provide additional context for the documentary evidence she had already presented. The mention of audio recordings caused Stevens to visibly flinch, her eyes darting toward the control room as if seeking guidance that would never come. Morrison activated the tablet's speaker, and the studio filled with the recorded voice of Stevens herself, engaged in what was clearly a coaching session with representatives from Meridian Communications Group. The recording revealed Stevens receiving detailed instructions on how to handle specific types of political guests, including techniques for interrupting opponents, strategies for framing questions to produce desired responses, and methods for creating the appearance of journalistic objectivity while systematically promoting predetermined narratives. Stevens' voice on the recording was eager and collaborative, a stark contrast to the defensive posture she now displayed on live television. Morrison paused the recording and addressed the camera directly, explaining that this particular session had taken place just 6 weeks earlier as part of what the consulting firm called advanced interviewing techniques designed to maintain narrative consistency across multiple programming platforms. She noted that similar coaching sessions had been provided to anchors and hosts throughout the television news industry, representing a coordinated effort to shape public opinion through carefully orchestrated media manipulation. Stevens attempted to interrupt, claiming that the recordings had been taken out of context, that all journalists received professional development training, and that Morrison was mischaracterizing routine industry practices as something sinister. But her protests lacked conviction, and her increasingly frantic tone only served to reinforce the damaging impression created by the audio evidence Morrison continued to present. The second recording featured Stevens discussing specific upcoming interviews with network executives and Meridian Communications Group representatives, including detailed strategies for handling what they referred to as problematic guests who might challenge approved messaging frameworks. The conversation revealed how Stevens had been provided with opposition research on Morrison herself, including personal information and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited during exactly the type of interview they were currently conducting. Morrison allowed the recording to play for several minutes, her expression remaining neutral as Stevens' voice detailed plans for what was described as neutralizing Morrison's credibility through personal attacks and strategic interruptions designed to prevent her from presenting evidence effectively. The irony was not lost on viewers who realized they were witnessing the very manipulation techniques being exposed in real time. Stevens rose from her chair again, this time directing her anger toward Morrison with an intensity that surprised even veteran television observers. She accused Morrison of illegally recording private conversations, of violating attorney-client privilege, and of engaging in industrial espionage designed to damage legitimate news organizations. Her voice echoed throughout the studio as she demanded that the interview be terminated immediately. Morrison responded by explaining that none of the recordings had been made illegally, that all conversations had been captured through legitimate surveillance operations conducted by federal investigators, and that Stevens herself had been informed of the possibility of recording through standard consent procedures that she had apparently forgotten signing. She produced additional documentation showing Stevens' written agreement to participate in what had been described as a routine professional development program. The revelation that Stevens had unknowingly consented to being recorded while receiving coaching on media manipulation techniques created another wave of chaos in the studio. Production assistants scrambled to verify the authenticity of the consent forms Morrison had produced, while legal advisors frantically reviewed the implications of their client having agreed to surveillance she was now claiming had been conducted illegally. Morrison continued her presentation with the same methodical precision that had characterized her approach from the beginning, explaining that the coaching sessions were just one component of a much larger system designed to coordinate messaging across multiple media platforms. She withdrew another set of documents from her portfolio, these detailing financial relationships between Meridian Communications Group and over 30 different television networks, radio stations, and digital media platforms. The scope of the manipulation network Morrison revealed was staggering in its complexity and reach. She detailed how Meridian Communications Group had received funding from multiple sources, including foreign governments, multinational corporations, and political organizations, all seeking to influence American public opinion through coordinated media messaging. The firm had developed sophisticated techniques for making this influence appear organic, using apparent journalistic independence to mask carefully orchestrated propaganda campaigns. Stevens found herself unable to respond effectively to the mounting evidence Morrison presented. Each document, each recording, each revelation built upon the previous ones to create an overwhelming case for systematic corruption that extended far beyond any individual journalist or network. Stevens's earlier attempts to discredit Morrison personally now appeared desperate and unconvincing in the face of such comprehensive documentation. Morrison played a third audio recording, this one featuring network executives discussing how to maintain the appearance of editorial independence while implementing messaging strategies developed by external consulting firms. The conversation revealed how programming decisions, guest selections, and even story coverage were being influenced by considerations that had nothing to do with news value or public interest. The recording included discussions of financial incentives provided to individual journalists and anchors who successfully implemented approved messaging frameworks, creating a system where professional advancement became directly tied to willingness to participate in coordinated manipulation efforts. Stevens' own name was mentioned multiple times as an example of successful integration of external messaging strategies into mainstream programming. Morrison paused the recording and turned to address Stevens directly, asking whether she had received financial bonuses for successfully implementing Meridian Communications Group messaging strategies during specific interview segments. The question was delivered with the same calm professionalism that had characterized Morrison's entire presentation, but its implications were devastating. Stevens attempted to deflect by claiming that all media professionals received performance-based compensation, that Morrison was trying to criminalize standard industry practices, and that these revelations represented nothing more than routine business operations being presented in misleading ways. But her defensive responses only served to confirm that the systems Morrison was describing actually existed, and that Stevens had indeed participated in them. Morrison reached into her portfolio once more, this time producing bank records that showed specific payments from Meridian Communications Group to Stevens' personal accounts, coinciding exactly with interview segments that had successfully promoted predetermined messaging objectives. The financial documentation was precise and comprehensive, showing not just the amounts and timing of payments, but also the specific performance metrics that had triggered compensation. The studio fell into stunned silence as Morrison methodically walked through the financial records, explaining how individual journalists had been incentivized to participate in messaging coordination through payments that were structured to appear as legitimate consulting fees or performance bonuses. She detailed how the system had been designed to maintain plausible deniability, while creating powerful financial motivations for journalists to abandon traditional ethical standards. Stevens stared at the bank records as if they might somehow disappear if she looked hard enough, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and something approaching despair. The evidence Morrison had presented was so comprehensive and well documented that denial was no longer possible, leaving Stevens with the devastating realization that her entire career had become a carefully documented example of media corruption. Morrison continued her presentation by revealing how the messaging coordination system extended beyond individual journalists to influence editorial decisions, programming schedules, and even hiring practices throughout the television news industry. She showed correspondence detailing how Meridian Communications Group had provided recommendations for which experts should be featured as regular contributors, which political stories should receive prominent coverage, and which perspectives should be systematically excluded from programming. The revelation that external consultants had been influencing hiring decisions throughout the news industry sent shockwaves through the studio staff, many of whom began to question whether their own career advancement had been influenced by factors beyond their professional qualifications. Morrison's presentation had evolved from an exposure of individual misconduct to a systematic revelation of industry-wide corruption that implicated virtually every aspect of television news production. Stevens made one final attempt to salvage her reputation by claiming that Morrison's evidence had been fabricated, that the recordings had been manipulated, and that the financial documents had been forged as part of an elaborate conspiracy to destroy legitimate journalism. But her accusations lacked credibility in the face of the comprehensive documentation Morrison had provided, and her increasingly desperate tone only reinforced the impression that she was attempting to cover up systematic misconduct. Morrison responded by explaining that all evidence had been verified through independent forensic analysis, that digital signatures and metadata had been authenticated by multiple expert sources, and that federal investigators had already confirmed the accuracy of every document and recording she had presented. She noted that additional verification was available through Freedom of Information Act requests, and that any news organization could independently confirm her findings through routine investigative techniques. The interview had now consumed over 30 minutes of live television time, during which Morrison had systematically dismantled not just Stevens' personal credibility, but the entire framework of trust upon which television news depended. She had revealed financial corruption, documented coordinated messaging manipulation, and exposed the mechanisms through which external interests had gained unprecedented influence over American media. Stevens sat in stunned silence, finally recognizing that continuing to challenge Morrison's evidence would only provide additional opportunities for more damaging revelations. The anchor who had begun the morning expecting to conduct a routine political interview now found herself at the center of the most significant media accountability moment in television history. Morrison began to organize her remaining documents, signaling that her presentation was approaching its conclusion. But the calm efficiency of her movements suggested that what viewers had witnessed represented only a portion of the evidence she had compiled, and that the full scope of media manipulation she had uncovered would continue to unfold long after the cameras stopped rolling. The studio remained in chaos as Morrison prepared to deliver what would prove to be the most devastating revelation of all, one that would extend the implications of her investigation far beyond the television news industry and into the highest levels of American political and corporate power. Stevens could only watch in horrified fascination as her world continued to collapse around her, one carefully documented revelation at a time. Morrison reached into her portfolio one final time, her movements carrying the weight of someone about to reveal information that would fundamentally alter the landscape of American media forever. The document she withdrew was different from the others, sealed in a protective plastic sleeve and marked with official government security classifications that immediately caught the attention of everyone in the studio. Stevens' eyes widened as she recognized the distinctive formatting of classified intelligence briefings, documents she had only seen in her most exclusive interviews with high-ranking government officials. The classified document represented something unprecedented in Morrison's presentation. While everything else had been obtained through legal channels available to any persistent investigator, this particular piece of evidence had required cooperation from intelligence agencies operating at the highest levels of national security. Morrison explained to the stunned studio audience that what she was about to reveal had been declassified specifically for this presentation, part of a coordinated effort by federal investigators to expose threats to American democratic institutions. Stevens attempted to object, claiming that classified information couldn't be broadcast on live television, that Morrison was violating federal espionage laws, and that the network could face criminal charges for allowing such material to be presented. But Morrison calmly explained that the document had been officially declassified 48 hours earlier, specifically to allow its contents to be shared with the American public, as part of what intelligence officials had determined was a matter of urgent national security interest. The revelation that federal intelligence agencies had been investigating media manipulation as a national security threat sent waves of shock through the studio and viewing audience. Morrison detailed how the investigation had begun 3 years earlier, when patterns of coordinated messaging had been identified that bore striking similarities to foreign influence operations previously documented in other democratic nations. Intelligence analysts had discovered that the same techniques used to manipulate media in countries like Ukraine and the United Kingdom were being systematically implemented in American newsrooms. Morrison began reading from the classified intelligence brief, her voice maintaining the same calm professionalism that had characterized her entire presentation. The document detailed how foreign intelligence services had identified American media outlets as vulnerable targets for influence operations, noting that the competitive nature of the television news industry and the financial pressures facing traditional journalism had created opportunities for external manipulation that had not existed in previous decades. The intelligence report revealed that Meridian Communications Group had been receiving funding not just from domestic political and corporate interests, but from foreign intelligence services seeking to influence American public opinion on issues ranging from international trade agreements to military interventions in overseas conflicts. The consulting firm had essentially become a conduit through which hostile foreign governments could directly influence American media coverage without the knowledge of the journalists and anchors who were implementing their messaging strategies. Stevens sat in stunned silence as Morrison detailed how the intelligence community had documented specific instances where foreign governments had successfully used Meridian Communications Group to influence American media coverage of international events. The report included examples where news coverage had been deliberately skewed to benefit foreign policy objectives that were directly contrary to American national interests, representing a form of information warfare that had been conducted through seemingly legitimate media channels. Morrison explained that Stevens herself had unknowingly participated in several of these foreign influence operations, including coverage of trade negotiations where her interview questions and editorial commentary had been crafted to promote positions that benefited foreign governments at the expense of American workers and businesses. The intelligence report documented how Stevens' apparent journalistic analysis had actually been developed by foreign intelligence services and transmitted through Meridian Communications Group's messaging coordination system. The revelation that she had been used as an unwitting agent of foreign influence operations struck Stevens like a physical blow. Her face drained of color as she realized that her own words and professional reputation had been weaponized against the country. She had always believed she was serving through her journalism. The confident anchor who had begun the morning ready to challenge Morrison's credibility now found herself confronting the devastating reality that she had been systematically manipulated by hostile foreign interests. Morrison continued reading from the intelligence brief, detailing how the foreign influence operation had extended far beyond individual journalists to influence programming decisions, editorial policies, and even hiring practices throughout the American media industry. Intelligence analysts had documented a sophisticated network of financial relationships and professional connections that allowed foreign governments to exert influence over American media coverage in ways that were virtually undetectable to traditional oversight mechanisms. The scope of the foreign influence operation Morrison described was staggering in its ambition and effectiveness. Intelligence agencies had identified over 200 journalists, anchors, and media executives who had unknowingly participated in foreign influence campaigns through their association with consulting firms and professional development programs that were actually fronts for intelligence operations. The network had successfully influenced coverage of major international events, domestic political campaigns, and economic policy debates over a period of more than 5 years. Stevens finally found her voice, asking in a tone barely above a whisper whether Morrison was claiming that she and her colleagues had been deliberately recruited by foreign intelligence services. Morrison clarified that most media professionals had been unwitting participants in the influence operations, manipulated through psychological techniques and financial incentives rather than through direct recruitment. The foreign intelligence services had recognized that American journalists' professional pride and ethical standards made them unlikely candidates for traditional espionage recruitment, so alternative methods had been developed to achieve the same objectives. Morrison explained how the foreign influence operation had exploited the American media industry's increasing reliance on external consultants and professional development programs to gain access to journalists and anchors who would never have knowingly cooperated with foreign intelligence services. The operation had been designed to make participation feel like career advancement rather than espionage, using techniques that had been refined through similar operations in other democratic nations. The intelligence brief detailed specific examples of how foreign governments had used their influence over American media coverage to shape public opinion during critical international negotiations, including trade agreements that had cost American workers thousands of jobs and military interventions that had served foreign strategic objectives rather than American national interests. Morrison noted that the economic and strategic costs of these successful influence operations had been estimated in the billions of dollars and had significantly weakened America's position in international relations. Stevens asked whether the intelligence agencies had known about these operations while they were ongoing, and why media professionals hadn't been warned about the possibility of foreign manipulation. Morrison explained that intelligence agencies had indeed detected the operations, but that revealing their knowledge would have compromised ongoing investigations and potentially allowed the foreign intelligence services to adapt their techniques to avoid detection. Morrison revealed that the decision to declassify information about the foreign influence operations had been made only after intelligence agencies had developed comprehensive countermeasures and had gathered sufficient evidence to prosecute both the foreign intelligence operatives and their American collaborators. She noted that several high-ranking executives at consulting firms like Meridian Communications Group were already under federal investigation for their knowing participation in foreign influence operations. The revelation that federal prosecutors were preparing criminal charges against American citizens who had knowingly facilitated foreign influence operations sent another wave of panic through the studio. Stevens realized that her own involvement, however unwitting, might still expose her to legal liability if investigators determined that she should have recognized the foreign nature of the messaging coordination she had participated in. Morrison assured Stevens that intelligence agencies had distinguished between unwitting participants who had been manipulated and willing collaborators who had knowingly facilitated foreign influence operations. She explained that most journalists and anchors who had been exposed to foreign influence would not face criminal charges, but would be expected to cooperate with ongoing investigations and to implement new procedures designed to prevent future manipulation. The intelligence brief included recommendations for media organizations to protect themselves against foreign influence operations, including enhanced vetting procedures for external consultants, increased transparency in financial relationships, and new training programs designed to help journalists recognize potential manipulation attempts. Morrison noted that these recommendations had already been shared with major media organizations and that implementation would be closely monitored by federal agencies. Stevens asked about the implications for media organizations that had unknowingly facilitated foreign influence operations, and whether networks like Sunrise Broadcasting would face regulatory sanctions or criminal liability. Morrison explained that the focus of federal investigations was primarily on the consulting firms and individuals who had knowingly served as conduits for foreign influence, rather than on the media organizations and journalists who had been manipulated. However, Morrison noted that media organizations would be expected to demonstrate good faith efforts to prevent future foreign influence operations by implementing recommended security procedures and by providing full cooperation with ongoing investigations. Organizations that fail to implement adequate protections or that continue to work with consulting firms under federal investigation could face regulatory sanctions, including potential license challenges. Morrison began organizing her documents for the final time, signaling that her presentation was approaching its conclusion. But before closing her portfolio, she withdrew one last item that would prove to be the most personally devastating revelation. For Stevens, the document was a personnel file from Meridian Communications Group, detailing Stevens' recruitment and development as what the firm had classified as a high-value media asset. The personnel file revealed that Stevens had been specifically targeted for recruitment based on her high visibility, her established credibility with audiences, and psychological assessments that had identified her as particularly susceptible to the flattery and professional validation that had been used to draw her into the foreign influence operation. The file included detailed analyses of her personality traits, professional ambitions, and personal vulnerabilities that had been exploited to ensure her cooperation with messaging coordination efforts. Stevens stared at the personnel file with a mixture of horror and fascination, seeing herself described in clinical terms as a subject for psychological manipulation rather than as a respected journalist. The file detailed how her interactions with Meridian Communications Group representatives had been carefully scripted to appeal to her professional pride and her desire for continued career advancement, creating emotional attachments that had made her less likely to question the messaging coordination she was being asked to implement. Morrison explained that similar personnel files existed for hundreds of American journalists and media personalities, representing the most comprehensive foreign influence operation ever documented by American intelligence agencies. The files demonstrated the sophisticated psychological techniques that had been used to manipulate media professionals who would never have knowingly cooperated with foreign intelligence services, but who had been gradually drawn into collaboration through carefully orchestrated professional relationships. The revelation that she had been the subject of detailed psychological analysis and targeted manipulation struck Stevens as profoundly violating, even more devastating than the financial corruption that had been exposed earlier in the interview. She realized that her professional relationships, her career advancement, and even her personal sense of journalistic accomplishment had all been artificially manufactured by foreign intelligence operatives who had viewed her as nothing more than a useful tool for influencing American public opinion. Morrison noted that the psychological manipulation documented in the personnel files represented a significant evolution in foreign intelligence operations, moving beyond traditional espionage techniques to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities and professional aspirations of targets who would never have been accessible through conventional recruitment methods. The operation had been designed to make participation feel rewarding and validating, rather than treasonous or unethical. Stevens asked whether other anchors and journalists at major networks had been similarly targeted and manipulated, and Morrison confirmed that the foreign influence operation had successfully recruited unwitting collaborators throughout the American media industry. She explained that the declassified intelligence brief represented only a small portion of the evidence that had been gathered, and that additional revelations would continue to emerge as federal investigations progressed. Morrison revealed that several major media personalities had already been briefed about their unwitting participation in foreign influence operations and were cooperating with federal investigators to understand how they had been manipulated and to prevent future exploitation. She noted that the willingness of media professionals to acknowledge their manipulation and to implement protective measures would be a crucial factor in determining how individual cases were handled by federal prosecutors. The intelligence brief included projections about the long-term impact of the foreign influence operations on American democratic institutions, noting that the successful manipulation of media coverage had contributed to increased political polarization, reduced public trust in democratic institutions, and weakened America's ability to respond effectively to international challenges. Intelligence analysts had concluded that the operations represented one of the most successful foreign attacks on American democracy in the nation's history. Morrison explained that the decision to expose the foreign influence operations through live television had been made specifically to demonstrate the scale and sophistication of the manipulation, while providing immediate transparency to the American public. Intelligence agencies had determined that traditional classified briefings and official reports would not adequately convey the urgency of the threat or the need for immediate defensive measures throughout the media industry. Stevens asked whether the foreign influence operations were still ongoing, and Morrison confirmed that while the specific network that had been exposed was no longer operational, intelligence agencies had identified similar operations being developed by other foreign intelligence services. She noted that the threat of foreign media manipulation would continue to evolve, and that constant vigilance would be required to protect American democratic institutions from future attacks. Morrison addressed the studio cameras directly, speaking to the millions of viewers who had witnessed this unprecedented exposure of foreign influence operations targeting American media. She explained that the revelations they had seen represented a critical moment in American history, when the success of foreign attacks on democratic institutions had been definitively documented and when the need for protective measures had become undeniably clear. She noted that American democracy had always depended on an informed citizenry receiving accurate information from trustworthy media sources, and that foreign intelligence services had specifically targeted this foundation by corrupting the information environment upon which democratic decision-making depended. The operations that had been exposed represented not just attacks on individual journalists or media organizations, but systematic assaults on the information infrastructure that made democratic governance possible. Morrison emphasized that the responsibility for protecting American democracy from foreign influence operations could not rest solely with intelligence agencies or federal investigators, but required active participation from media organizations, journalists, and citizens who demanded transparency and accountability from their information sources. She called for increased media literacy education, enhanced transparency requirements for media organizations, and stronger penalties for those who knowingly facilitated foreign influence operations. Stevens sat in contemplative silence as Morrison concluded her presentation, finally understanding the full scope of the manipulation she had unknowingly participated in and the damage that had been inflicted on American democratic institutions through her own words and professional reputation. The anchor who had begun the morning ready to challenge Morrison's credibility now found herself confronting the devastating reality that her entire career had been compromised by foreign intelligence operations. Morrison closed her portfolio and stood to leave, explaining that additional evidence would continue to be released through official government channels and that federal investigations would ensure that all responsible parties were held accountable for their participation in foreign influence operations. She noted that the American people deserved to know the full truth about how their media had been manipulated, and that transparency was the first step toward preventing future attacks on democratic institutions. As Morrison gathered her materials and prepared to exit the studio, Stevens made one final statement, her voice carrying none of the authority and confidence that had characterized her journalism for nearly 2 decades. She acknowledged that she had been manipulated by foreign intelligence services, that her journalism had been compromised by influence operations she had not recognized, and that she bore responsibility for failing to protect her audience from foreign propaganda that had been disguised as legitimate news analysis. Stevens announced that she would be stepping down from her position as anchor, effective immediately, and that she would be cooperating fully with federal investigations to help understand how foreign influence operations had succeeded in manipulating American media. She apologized to her viewers for unknowingly serving as a conduit for foreign propaganda and committed to working toward reforms that would prevent similar manipulation in the future. The studio fell into profound silence as Stevens removed her anchor credentials and walked away from the desk where she had delivered news to millions of Americans for nearly 2 decades. Morrison exited quietly, her mission accomplished and her evidence presented with the systematic precision that had characterized her entire presentation. The cameras continued to roll, capturing images that would be remembered as marking the moment when American media was forced to confront the reality of foreign influence operations that had successfully corrupted the information environment upon which democracy depended. Within hours of Morrison's presentation, federal agencies announced the largest investigation into foreign influence operations in American history, with dozens of media personalities, consulting firms, and corporate executives under scrutiny for their roles in facilitating foreign attacks on democratic institutions. Sunrise Broadcasting Network faced potential license challenges and regulatory sanctions, while advertisers began withdrawing support from programming that had been identified as vehicles for foreign propaganda. The revelations sparked congressional hearings, regulatory reforms, and a fundamental reassessment of how American media organizations protected themselves against foreign manipulation. Morrison's methodical presentation had not only exposed the specific operations that had corrupted American journalism, but had also provided a roadmap for defensive measures that could protect democratic institutions from future attacks. Stevens never returned to television journalism, instead dedicating herself to educating other media professionals about the techniques used by foreign intelligence services to manipulate unwitting collaborators. Morrison became a leading advocate for media transparency and democratic institution protection, using her experience to help develop new standards for identifying and preventing foreign influence operations. The American public learned that morning that the information they had been receiving through trusted media sources had been systematically corrupted by foreign intelligence services, and that protecting democracy would require constant vigilance against manipulation techniques that evolved continuously to exploit new vulnerabilities in the information environment. The exposure of these operations marked the beginning of a new era in American media, one where transparency and accountability would be essential for maintaining the informed citizenry upon which democratic governance depends. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.